On a winter night more than a century ago, when the world seemed frozen not only by the cold, but by fear and exhaustion and the weight of a war that had already gone on far longer than anyone had imagined, something quietly extraordinary began to unfold along the muddy line that separated thousands of young men who had been told they were enemies. The trenches, carved into the scarred earth of Flanders, stretched endlessly under a sky that held more smoke than stars, and the air was so cold that even breath seemed to hesitate before dissolving into the darkness. Soldiers on both sides huddled beneath blankets stiff with frost, listening to distant artillery and the restless shuffling of men who simply could not get warm. They had been promised a short war, a quick campaign, an adventure that would send them marching home by the time the leaves fell. Instead, they found themselves living in narrow ribbons of earth, surrounded by mud so deep it swallowed boots, and by a silence that was broken only by the sounds of misery. In that bleak world, Christmas Eve felt like any other night at first, merely another page in the long gray stretch of time that had begun to blend days and nights together until almost nothing could be remembered clearly. Many men, British, French, Belgian, and German alike, had already given up expecting anything different from the day, for even the simplest traditions of home were impossibly far away. Yet something subtle was shifting, like the first faint spark of light glowing behind thick clouds. Some soldiers later said they could feel it before they heard it, an unusual stillness, a strange softness in the wind, as if the world itself were taking a long, deep breath. It began almost like a rumor drifting through the cold, moving from one trench to another in low voices that carried only as far as they needed to. A British soldier might say he thought he saw small, flickering lights in the German trench, not lanterns used for work, not the sharp flash of a match, but something steadier, warmer, more like a candle flame glowing against wooden boards. A German soldier might whisper that someone on their side had quietly mentioned the possibility that perhaps, only for one night, the shooting might cease. No one believed it, of course, because hope felt like something fragile. Too fragile to risk in a place where even a thoughtless movement could bring sudden death. Still, the rumor refused to die, rising again and again, as stubborn as the cold. As night deepened and a gentle fall of snow began to soften the outlines of the trenches, a moment came that many men would remember for the rest of their lives. Somewhere along the German line, a single voice began to sing. It might have been soft at first, almost tentative the way a candle flame wavers before it steadies, but slowly the notes grew clearer, traveling out across the empty stretch of land that separated the two sides. The melody was familiar even to those who did not know German well, a simple, beautiful hymn that had drifted through generations each winter. Stille Nacht, heilige Nacht. The words floated over no man's land like a gentle wind. At first, the British soldiers listened in stunned silence, unsure whether this was mockery or a trap or some incomprehensible attempt at communication. But the singing did not stop. Instead, other voices joined, blending into a gentle harmony that carried warmth into the cold night. And then something unexpected stirred among the British ranks. Perhaps one man hummed under his breath. Perhaps another quietly murmured a line of a carol he hadn't thought about since leaving home. Slowly, almost shyly, the British voices rose in answer, singing back a carol of their own, one that filled the air with a soft, familiar comfort. It is said that after the British finished their song, the Germans clapped and cheered, and the British laughed in surprise, and for the first time in months, the night held something other than fear. What followed was a strange, fragile chorus that drifted above the battlefield. One side would sing a carol, and the other would answer with another. It went on not for minutes, but for long stretches of time, until the cold felt somehow less biting, the darkness less oppressive, and the men, each one wrapped in his own thoughts, felt something stir within them that had nearly been smothered by months of war. At some point during the night, someone called out across the darkness, a German voice speaking in accented English, saying something like, "Tommy, you sing good." And laughter rolled softly from one trench to the other. Laughter in a place that had forgotten the sound, It spread faster than any order ever had, warming the frozen air with something that felt almost alive. When dawn came on Christmas morning, pale and slow, the world seemed to hold its breath once more. Snow covered the scarred earth, giving to it, just for a moment, the illusion of peace. And then, in an act that defied everything the soldiers had been taught, a German soldier rose from his trench, standing in full view. His hands were held high, his posture as open as a man stepping toward a friend. Rifles were raised on the British side, not out of hatred, but fear, for such a thing had never been seen before. Yet the German did not falter, and another man stood beside him, and then a third, and very slowly, very cautiously, a British soldier climbed out of his own trench to meet them. What followed cannot be fully explained by strategy or logic or even military history. It was something deeper, something human, something that rose up from the buried instincts that had been smothered by months of violence. The men walked toward each other one by one, and then in groups, crossing the distance that had been filled with bullets only hours before. They greeted each other with hesitant smiles, with nods, with outstretched hands. Some shook hands, awkwardly, others embraced, and still others simply stood silent, overwhelmed by the strangeness of the moment. Cigarettes were exchanged, and chocolate and small tokens that bore no monetary value but immense symbolic weight. A British soldier took out a picture of his sweetheart and showed it proudly to a German who responded by pulling out a family photograph of his own. A German barber offered haircuts with a small pair of scissors, and a British soldier attempted to fix a German's jammed lighter. Laughter grew more frequent, and the harsh lines of fear began to fade from young faces that had forgotten how to relax. Somewhere in the open field, a group of soldiers found a ball. Some accounts say it was real, others say it was improvised from bundled socks, and soon a casual, clumsy game of football began. There were no clear teams, no rules, just men running through snow, slipping and shouting with the kind of joy that had no place on a battlefield, and yet somehow belonged there all the same. The story of that game would later take on mythic proportions, but surviving letters and diaries describe not a single match, but many small scattered ones, each one a brief and imperfect moment where war loosened its grip. Not all the moments were filled with laughter, however. Many soldiers, British and German and French alike, used the truce to recover the bodies of fallen comrades who had lain between the trenches for days or weeks, unreachable during fighting. Together, side by side, men carried stretcher after stretcher, sometimes placing a British soldier next to a German one, the distinctions of uniform fading beneath the equal stillness of death. Joint services were held, with prayers spoken in different languages but understood by all who bowed their heads. In these moments, the silence felt heavy. But it was no longer the oppressive, fearful silence of war. It was the solemn quiet of shared grief, a grief that stretched across national lines and touched every man present. The truce lasted in some places for hours, in others for an entire day, and in a few extraordinary locations for several days after Christmas. But even as the men built small fires, brewed makeshift tea, and exchanged simple gifts fashioned from scrap wire or carved wood, a shadow loomed, for the truce was born from the front lines themselves, not from the commands of generals. And those generals, back in their warm headquarters far from the mud and misery, were not pleased when word reached them. To them, what had unfolded in the snow was not a miracle, but a threat, a dangerous reminder that soldiers were human beings, capable of empathy, capable of connection, capable of recognizing themselves in the eyes of those they had been taught to shoot. Orders were issued swiftly. Fraternization was condemned in the strongest terms. Warnings were sent that any repetition would be punished. Letters that mentioned the truce were censored or destroyed, and official histories quietly minimized what had happened, treating it as an isolated, insignificant event rather than the widespread, spontaneous uprising of humanity that it truly was. By the next Christmas, the war had grown even more brutal, and any attempts at rekindling the truce were crushed immediately by artillery fire deliberately ordered to prevent such contact. Yet, despite the best efforts of those who wished to bury the story, the truth survived in the memories of the men who lived through it, passed down in letters smuggled home, in diary entries hidden in coat pockets, and in the quiet recollections shared long after the war ended. Some of those men did not survive much longer, like Fred, a young British soldier who wrote home describing the beauty of Christmas before being killed the following spring. Others, like Otto, the German violinist, lived to return home and grow old, teaching music and remembering the night when the world paused. Still others, like Louis the French schoolteacher, died before the war's end, leaving behind only a few pages of poetry and the memory of the day when soldiers lowered their rifles and raised their voices instead. The Christmas Truce stands as one of the most remarkable moments in modern history, not because it changed the course of the war, which continued for nearly 4 more years, but because it revealed something profound about human nature, something that generals feared and soldiers understood, that the instinct to connect is stronger than the instinct to destroy, that even in the darkest winter there is a spark of warmth waiting to be kindled, and that within each person, regardless of the uniform they wear, there is the same longing for home, for peace, for safety, for a life that stretches beyond the reach of war. As snow settled over the battlefields once more, the men eventually returned to their trenches, some reluctantly, others with a quiet resignation, knowing that the brief moment of peace would soon be swallowed by the relentless machinery of conflict. But they carried something with them that could not be confiscated by commanding officers, something that would not fade even under fire. The knowledge that the so-called enemy was, in truth, a mirror. And once a man sees himself reflected in another, the world is never quite the same again. And so the memory lingers, drifting like snow over silent fields, softening the harsh edges of history. It reminds us that even in the harshest winters there can be warmth. Even in the deepest darkness a light can appear. And even in a world torn apart by war for one fragile night, peace is possible. It may have been suppressed. It may have been minimized. It may have been nearly erased. But it was real. And it is worth remembering, especially when the world feels cold once more.